Welcome to another Big Train Tour at the Colorado Railroad Museum. This week, we'll be taking a look at a diesel locomotive hailing from a brand name railroad, Coors. From 1981 to 2004, this locomotive was a fixture at the Coors plant right here in Golden. But prior to its Coors service, it was part of the story of the now vanished Rock Island Railroad, dating back to the late 1930s and the early introduction of diesel locomotives on America's railroads. Today, this bright red switching locomotive is proudly displayed at the museum, offering guests the chance to sit in its cab and learn how a diesel-electric locomotive functions. Hi, I'm Paul Hammond, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. Our subject big train today is a diminutive switching locomotive, but not just any switcher. This locomotive enjoyed a long service life which began on one of the major railroads serving Colorado and concluded right here in Golden. Although most of its time was spent working for the Rock Island route, the locomotive underwent a complete overhaul in the 1950s and emerged with a new appearance along with a new number. The Coors Brewery served as its final service location, albeit it perhaps gained more notoriety there than while operating on the Rock. Let's step back in time now and examine the history of Coors Brewery locomotive number C988. The Coors Brewery in Golden traces its history to before Colorado was even a state. In 1873, German native Adolf Coors and Jacob Schuler established a brewery in Golden. Coors had emigrated earlier from the German state of Prussia after working early on in breweries where he would learn the art and science of crafting a good lager. Together with his business partner, Adolf in 1873 purchased a former tannery on the banks of Clear Creek just east of downtown Golden. It took several years and much work for Coors to convert the former tannery to beer production. His signature beer required big brew kettles for the initial cooking and caves dug into the adjacent mountains where the lager could be fermented at carefully controlled temperatures. In 1880, Coors bought out his business partner and became the sole owner. By 1890, the brewery's annual output had grown to 17,600 barrels, up from just 3,500 barrels 10 years earlier. The company was now firmly established. The Rock Island route, on the other hand, had an even more colorful history. Construction of the railroad began in Chicago in 1851, and the first train of the Chicago and Rock Island Railroad made it to Joliet, Illinois, in October 1852. By early 1854, the line reached the Mississippi River at Rock Island, becoming the first railroad line to connect Chicago with the river. A separate company was created in 1853 to run a railroad line in Iowa between Davenport and Council Bluffs, and the very first railroad bridge over the Mississippi was completed between Rock Island and Davenport in April 1856. Just 15 days after the opening of that bridge, disaster struck. A steamboat collided with the bridge, burst into flames, and sank, destroying one span of the bridge in the process. If you've never heard about this situation, you may want to read more about what turns out to be a major stepping stone in the making of modern America. You see, it appears that this accident was anything but an accident. Powerful political interests were bringing a major issue to the forefront in a violent and confrontational manner. The ensuing litigation attracted national attention and became the most notable court case for an aspiring Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was already an experienced railroad lawyer when he accepted the case. What was at stake was essentially the future of United States transportation policy. Why? Because Southern interests were determined to stop bridges from being built over navigable waterways. The South had a monopoly on north-south river transportation that funneled into the Gulf of Mexico through New Orleans. The technology of the railroad threatened to create new east-west transportation corridors that would upend the old order. These bridges would increase settlement of areas by people from so-called free states, and in turn hasten the end of slavery. How did the case turn out? Well, Today there are many bridges over waterways throughout the U.S., so you can probably guess. But just imagine if this were not the case. In this instance, the issue made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court before it was finally settled. The case was decided by the court in 1863, but even then, a similar case had to be reconfirmed by the Supreme Court in 1867 before it was clear that bridges were not merely obstructions, but actually had a right to be built over rivers. And here's something else to consider. Had this case made it to the Supreme Court prior to the South's secession in early 1861, the outcome might well have been the opposite. Okay, we're now back from that little sidetrack and back on to our mainline topic of the Rock Island Route. Reorganized in 1866 under the name Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific, this pioneering standard gauge Granger Railroad would eventually expand into Arkansas, Colorado, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Oklahoma, South Dakota, and Texas. Here in Colorado, the railroad's route connected to Denver, Colorado Springs, and Pueblo. By the late 19th century, the Rock Island Railroad was fairly prosperous. It also had gained a reputation for the Pullman sleeping and dining cars found in its finest passenger trains. As it entered the 20th century, however, the Rock Island route fell into the hands of the Reed-Moore Syndicate, sometimes called the Big Four of prairie railroading, and was soon in trouble through reckless overexpansion. It would prosper briefly in the 1920s, but depression and repeated crop failures in its service territory would weaken the railroad financially by the 1930s. The earliest commercially successful diesel-electric locomotives were produced in the U.S. in the 1920s. Their horsepower ratings were quite low, and they were limited to slow-speed switching in specialized locations where steam locomotives could not be used. As early as 1934, however, a diesel engine was used to power the Burlington's very first Pioneer Zephyr streamlined passenger train set. Streamlined trains pulled by diesels were soon introduced on other U.S. railroads, including the Santa Fe and the Union Pacific. Not wanting to be left behind, the Rock Island route commissioned Philadelphia-based railroad car builder Budd to construct 6 lightweight, streamlined stainless steel passenger train sets. These would be pulled by 6 Model TA locomotives constructed by the Electromotive Corporation, and they'd cause quite a stir when they were inaugurated on several routes. Uniquely, although the passenger train sets were articulated, the locomotives were separately attached, setting these trains apart from the earlier Union Pacific and Burlington streamliners, which were fully articulated. The railroad would go on to introduce a new Rocky Mountain Rocket passenger train between Chicago and Denver in late 1939. At Limon, Colorado, the train was split into 2 sections, with one serving Colorado Springs and thus offering a 1-seat ride between Chicago and Colorado Springs. A unique, one-of-a-kind trailing locomotive with a flat nose would usually lead the Colorado Springs section of the Rocket until its demise in the 1960s. When operating as part of the combined train east of Limon, the second locomotive blended right in so as to be unobtrusive. At the same time that it was introducing streamlined passenger train sets in the late 1930s, the Rock Island was modernizing its steam locomotive fleet while also trying out freight service diesels. Its first diesel-electric switchers were introduced in 1937, with more following the very next year. And this is where we reach the inception of our subject locomotive. Also built by Electromotive, diesel-electric switcher number 515 was one of an order of 29 purchased by the Rock Island route. It was delivered to the railroad in 1938. Designated as Model SW, the S stood for its horsepower output, 600, and the W stood for the type of construction used on its frame, welded. The Rock Island would become the largest all-time purchaser of this early diesel locomotive model. Electromotive also in the late 1930s offered Model SC, 600 horsepower with a cast steel frame, as well as switcher models NW and NC, which sported 900 horsepower with a welded or cast underframe. Over time, diesel builder Electromotive would revise its model number protocols with SW becoming short for switcher, and a following number, 900, 1200, 1500, etc., designating the horsepower rating. The Rock Island, in its precarious pre-war financial situation, would add a few more diesel locomotives to its roster from other builders including Alco and Baldwin. Following the war, the railroad would quickly move to dieselize completely, adding as many new locomotives as it could afford. Perhaps not surprisingly, Rock Island switchyards do not appear to have been well photographed during this time frame. Thus, images of the railroad's early switchers in service from the late 1930s to the mid-1950s are fairly rare. What is clear from the surviving photographs is that the railroad prided itself on maintaining its fleet at least until after World War II. Most likely, short-lived wartime prosperity was to thank for this soon-to-conclude situation. Another peculiar trait of the Rock Island lines was its extensive use of switchers with horsepower ratings of less than 1,000. As locomotive builders increased horsepower output, the Rock Island continued to purchase numerous switchers in the 600 to 900 horsepower rating. There was a reason for this. The railroad operated in relatively flat territory, and it regularly used switching locomotives in local freight service on smaller and more lightly constructed branch lines. Only starting in the 1960s did the railroad purchase higher horsepower switchers, and only because the lower horsepower models were no longer being built. Locomotives wear out, of course, and the Rock Island's pioneering fleet of diesel-electric switchers was no different. By the mid-1950s, locomotives like number 515 were approaching 20 years of hard, continuous service. Perhaps equally important, their early diesel engines and electrical components had become obsolete and were getting harder to repair. Thus, the railroad worked with manufacturer Electromotive to completely rebuild its fleet of late 1930s model SW switchers. Rebuild might be overly generous in description because these locomotives were almost completely new. They received new diesel engines, also called prime movers, along with new frames, hoods, and cabs, among other things in the process. Two different variations emerged. Model SW900M, which was equipped with a new EMD Model 567 diesel engine rated at 600 horsepower, and reusing the original 1930s General Electric built generator, and Model SW900, which featured an EMD 567 engine rated at 900 horsepower, along with a new generator rated for the higher power output. Our subject locomotive, Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Switcher 515, would become the railroad's first locomotive to undergo this remanufacturing process. It emerged from EMD's LaGrange, Illinois facility in January 1957, sporting a completely new look, along with a new identity. This 600 horsepower model SW900M locomotive was now numbered 550. Its 28 classmates soon followed suit, being rebuilt one by one, with the final SW900 locomotive completed in late 1959. The Rock Island hit its peak during the decade immediately following World War II. But as the 1960s approached, the railroad found itself faced with a lack of traffic growth and declining revenues. Increasing costs, competition from trucks and airplanes, a rigid regulatory environment for rate setting, and a general lack of innovation in the railroad industry would strangle a number of U.S. railroads over the next 2 decades. The main issue in the Rock's case was that there were simply too many railroads in the Plain States, all competing for the same declining traffic. The only way for the railroad to grow its revenues while decreasing costs would be to merge with another. So in 1964, the Rock Island agreed to a merger proposal with the Union Pacific Railroad. If successful, the merger would have created a super railroad stretching from Chicago to the West Coast. The proposed merger was controversial, and it ended up taking 10 years for the U.S. Interstate Commerce Commission to approve. In the meantime, the Rock Island route had become unprofitable, and many conditions had been placed on the merger. The railroad had also cut expenditures on track maintenance, and locomotives were given just enough attention to keep them running. In the end, the Union Pacific decided that this merger was no longer worth consummating. Less than a year later, in 1975, the railroad declared bankruptcy for the third time. A brief respite came as new management sought financing, undertook major track repairs, and bought new locomotives. The railroad even looked like it would soon turn a profit. But then the final shoe dropped. One of the three different unions representing the railroad's employees refused to negotiate. Picket lines went up and operations ground to a halt. Although management swung into action and got things moving again, the ICC declared a transportation emergency. Soon thereafter, the railroad was shut down and liquidated. Somehow, through all of this corporate drama, the railroad's fleet of locomotives, including switcher number 550, continued operating, although their numbers dwindled through the 1970s. Maintenance was minimal, and all kinds of slow orders were found on the Rock Island's deteriorating trackage. The railroad hosted a colorful roster of locomotives, many of them secondhand and some even dating back to the 1940s. Even fresh paint and a new The Rock rebranding campaign could only do so much to overcome the image of this not too prosperous railroad. After the Rock Island's inglorious end in January 1980, locomotives, freight cars and equipment, tracks and real estate were sold to other railroads or to scrappers. The Chrome Crankshaft Company of Illinois, which specializes in reconditioning, overhaul, and sale of diesel locomotives among other things, purchased much of the Rock Island fleet, reconditioning and selling individual locomotives or groups of locomotives to interested buyers. One of these buyers would be Coors Brewing Company. In 1981, 5 former Rock Island Line's diesel switchers were moved to Golden, Colorado, following yet another overhaul. 2 of these locomotives, including the former Rock Island number 550, had ended their Rock Island careers as 600 horsepower model SW900Ms, while the other 3 were their higher-rated 900 horsepower cousins. It appears that all 5 were overhauled to a new standard, equivalent to model SW8, with rebuilt engines and upgraded generators providing a power output of 800 horsepower each. Numbered C987 through C991, these 5 switchers would be introduced to a company-operated railroad serving the world's largest single-site brewery. Our subject locomotive became number C988, and it could be found working throughout the Coors plant all through the 1980s and 1990s and into the early 2000s. By this time, the Coors Railroad network featured approximately 35 miles of trackage. Connecting to the outside world via the newly merged Burlington Northern, the Coors Plant Railroad was the final customer on BN's 16-mile Golden subdivision. Even today, the Coors plant remains busy with daily BNSF trains still operating to keep up with the incoming and outgoing traffic. The 1980s and 1990s, however, were even busier, by far. Traffic during these years was especially brisk, with typical incoming loads including coal for the brewery's power plant, wheat and barley for the actual brewing processes, sweeteners and other ancillary brewing items, plus materials for packaging and more. Outbound loads from Coors, 600 to 700 freight cars per week, featured boxcars loaded with bottles and cans of beer packaged in boxes, plus something new at the time: tank car loads of beer, which were filled at the plant and moved directly to distribution centers around the country. Originally the Colorado and Southern Railroad, a predecessor to Burlington Northern, served and switched the Coors Brewery. As the Coors complex grew, it expanded down Clear Creek Valley. Several yards for storing and gathering freight cars were constructed, and starting in the 1960s, Coors decided to buy its own locomotives and oversee the switching itself. Locomotive C988 served well in this new environment. Photographs show it pulling loads around the complex, then running light to grab the next string of cars, as a matter of course. Switcher number C988 led a busy life, and in the early 1990s it received upgraded electric traction motors and a rebuilt, more modern engine. Not surprisingly, the company had a small fleet of locomotives, so number C988 wasn't the only one to be seen when photographers were at work. Coors at the time did its own track work and locomotive maintenance, and train crews operated around the clock on 8-hour shifts. All the crews were necessary not only for just moving things around, but also for the intensive work needed within the brewing complex itself. Incoming carloads from the Burlington Northern would arrive at the east end of the complex and be broken up for spotting at the correct destinations within the plant. Carloads of grain would be spotted at silos located at the east end of the complex for unloading. Then the empties moved to the far west end to be picked up by Burlington Northern. These activities typically required 2 to 3 crews each shift. A separate commodities crew moved carloads of grain, as needed, from the east silo to the west silo, which was in close proximity to the brewing rooms. And within the brewery itself, 2 transfer tables were used to move cars sideways between tracks in confined spaces. A separate crew was assigned to each of these unique transfer tables around the clock in order to keep things moving in the brewing and bottling processes. The Coors plant was humming. All of this activity came to a sudden end one day in 2004 when locomotive C988 was involved in an unfortunate accident. Several carloads apparently got away from the crew and ended up crashing into the locomotive. The force of the collision bent the locomotive's end platform and frame, crushed part of the cab, and did a lot of damage to its mechanical components as well. It looked like this was the end of the line for this long-lived, pioneering switcher. Fortunately for the damaged locomotive, Coors Brewing was receptive to an inquiry from the Colorado Railroad Museum. Would the company be willing to donate it for display? The answer was yes. Coors went to work, removing the locomotive's mechanical and electrical components. Readied for its new life as a museum exhibit, Coors Switcher C988 in August 2004 was loaded onto a flatbed trailer for the short trip to the museum. It was displayed initially on tracks immediately east of the main depot building. The museum had also been storing another locomotive, Denver and Rio Grande Western GP30 number 3011, at the Coors plant, and it was moved to the museum at this same time. Locomotive C988 joined another brewing-related favorite at the museum, Adolph Coors refrigerated boxcar number 5400. This reefer car dates from the late 1920s and was used in the 1930s to ship Coors beer to market from Golden. The unpasteurized Pilsner-style beer that Coors is famous for requires refrigeration at every step of the way, from brewery to market. Shortly after the locomotive's arrival at the museum, work was undertaken to reconstruct several missing components in the cab. In the process, another idea surfaced to make the switcher's cab into a simulator environment so guests could get a sense of what it takes to operate a diesel-electric switcher. A low-tech setup was installed, with control handles in the cab actuating a sound unit to represent the sounds of engine idling, acceleration, braking, and of course the whistle and bell. For many years, this setup ran faithfully as a self-serve exhibit, with guests depositing a quarter for a few minutes worth of time in the engineer's seat. It required occasional maintenance, and like any interactive exhibit, it occasionally was out of order. But starting in 2020 and 21, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, the simulator was regularly out of service due to extremely rough handling by guests. The throttle handle, which is machined out of cast metal, was broken off repeatedly. Something different had to be done. Today, Coors Switcher number C988 is being reintroduced to museum guests as an interactive exhibit during summer weekends and special events, when volunteers are available to staff the cab. This has the additional benefit of providing a human instructor and interpreter whenever the simulator is in use, adding greatly to the experience. The Colorado Railroad Museum looks forward to sharing this hands-on experience with many more guests in the coming months and years. Thanks for joining me today. Coors Switcher C988 is an icon of Golden, Colorado, and Rocky Mountain beer fans everywhere. But its long history reminds us that Colorado once hosted many different railroads, helping to connect the Centennial State to the rest of the United States. Its long service life and many rebuildings also provide a sense of how locomotives constantly undergo maintenance and repair and remanufacture. In a very real sense, the tale of my grandfather's axe applies. The handle of that axe had been replaced twice, and the head of that axe was at least once, but it was still my grandfather's axe. I hope you've enjoyed our tour of this Colorado classic locomotive with its early diesel locomotive status, long service life, and colorful history. I also hope that your appreciation for Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collections.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.